conversation about sex education from the previous video. We have these two different types of sex education programs that we can have in our schools. The first way is to teach abstinence, where we teach students to abstain from sex outside of marriage. Now, as a parent, I prefer that be the method that's taught. However, I'm not so naive to think that kids are not going to be having sex. And so, when I think about how to teach it in school, I think about this comprehensive method maybe as the best method. So what it teaches is abstinence plus. So it teaches abstinence, but it also teaches how to prevent disease and how to prevent pregnancy. And so I asked the question last semester, I guess it was, about should sex education be taught in schools. And I had several people say yes, and I don't think that's a bad answer. And when I asked why, I had multiple people say so that they can teach about disease. And that was different because I haven't heard anybody say that before. Usually it's, well, there's a lot of people getting pregnant, whatever, that, that needs to be taught so they know how to keep from getting pregnant. Well, the disease thing is a big deal. One of the students that said that she knew of a girl that had been with like 12 different people and a guy that had been with kind of a similar number. I don't remember the exact number. And so because they're sleeping with so many different people, then there easily could be diseases that are passed around. Another girl in the class said that she knew somebody who had been sexually active and had gotten a sexually transmitted disease. And so when that happens, there's no going back from that point. And so there is some need to teach, how to prevent diseases and how to prevent pregnancy. Now, as a parent, I would love to be able to teach abstinence only. You just don't do it, don't have sex before marriage. From a religious standpoint, that's what I'm going to teach my kids. That's what the Bible says, and so that's what I'm going to teach them. However, I do know that kids are going to end up experimenting, and they're going to, a lot of kids are going to have sex before marriage. And so I don't want them to not be knowledgeable of how to prevent pregnancy and how to prevent disease, but I do prefer that abstinence be taught. And so when we think about is the school the appropriate place, I would say yes. And some people might say no, it's not. The reason I say yes is because this is the only time that you have such a large number of students at the same time that you can address these sexual issues. Because there are going to be kids that don't know. There are going to be kids that know way more than you wish they did. I think of the comedian Bill Engvall has a skit where he talks about having the talk with his son, and his son was like 12 or whatever, and he makes the joke that he was talking to him and he started out with, well, what do you know? And he said before his kid got done, he'd got a pencil and a piece of paper and was taking notes. Obviously, that's a joke, but the point is, kids a lot of times know a lot more than you would think they do, and so it is important that if we are going to address this, and this is going to be something that's taught in schools, it's got to be done at an early age, 7th grade, 6th grade maybe, when hormones start running and body changes are happening. These things need to start coming up. And if I were putting a plan in play at a school to teach sex education, I would want it taught every year. Maybe not, for a long period of time, but within a curriculum, a week, 2 weeks, spend talking about sex education. Even if that's that you bring in speakers or you bring in people to talk about it, inform the students about sex education. So in my opinion, the comprehensive method is the best for schools. As a parent, I want the abstinence taught. That may or may not be the best for all students. Okay, so just be aware of that. Now, as we continue on talking about different types of social issues, another social issue that we see a lot of times is child abuse. In Chapter 8, we talked about legal and ethical issues. We talked about child abuse because as a teacher, if you see it, you have to report it. Or if you suspect it, you have to report it. And so some signs that a student may be physically abused would be things like repeated injuries, bruises, welts, even burns. Some people will take a cigarette and burn their kid, and I have no idea why, but that is something that happens at times. If the kid has a neglected appearance, they're just not well clothed, they're not well taken care of, if they're having to steal food, they have a hard time staying awake, poor hygiene, when kids start getting to the 4th, 5th, 6th grade, there's going to be body odor. Okay, so that's, and sometimes that's because the kid doesn't have anything, doesn't have deodorant, and doesn't have, they're not consistently being able to brush their teeth or whatever. And so there can be some things like that. But as they continue to have poor hygiene, that can sometimes be a sign that a kid's being abused. If they have a sudden fall off in academic performance, that also can be a sign. Now, it's not always the sign, but that's a sign typically that something's happened in that child's life, and it could be that it's abuse, it could be that something else has happened. If a kid, I'll give you an example. There's a kid that is friends with my son who had a family member that was killed that was about the same age, and this kid that was friends with my son, he was big into sports and he made good grades and all this stuff, and then all of a sudden his grades started falling and he started doing poorly in school and all of that. Well, from a teacher standpoint, you'd say that and you go, okay, something's happened. Well, what had happened is he lost a family member he was close to. Kind of had some depression and some things, and so that was a tough situation. And so there was a fall off in academic performance, but it wasn't abuse. Now, it could have been a sign of abuse, but there weren't any other signs. It was strictly an emotional thing because he'd had an emotional trauma. If they're disruptive, but if they have disruptive behavior, sometimes even if they're passive, kind of withdrawn behavior, both of those can be a sign that there's abuse. And then if they're secretive, when they use the internet, that can also be a warning sign, because you don't know if they're looking up ways to violently hurt somebody or do something from that standpoint, or if they're if they're secretive about what they're looking at, sometimes that can be a sign as well. Again, if you suspect child abuse, you must report it. So, there it is, that first statement. If you suspect it, you must report it. Now, if you were to estimate the percentage of students at your school who abuse drugs or alcohol, because this abuse that we're talking about is not always child abuse. It's not always physical abuse. It may be that the kid is abusing a drug or alcohol or something of that sort. And so this abuse is kind of a broad term. It definitely can be child abuse, which you typically see more at the younger age. But as they get older, you a lot of times see them purposely abusing drugs and alcohol. And so I always ask the question, just because I'm curious, the estimated percentage of students at your school where you graduated from that abuse drugs or alcohol. And I've heard numbers as high as 99%. Usually I hear people say 95%, especially when it comes to alcohol. And so the next question then becomes, as a teacher, what should you do if you suspect one of your students is using drugs or binge drinking? And we say binge drinking because you're not going to know when a kid has had a drink or maybe got drunk one time. But if a kid is drinking all the time, well, that's a problem. And so what should you do? Well, one of the things is you should probably try to confront that student and just say, hey, is everything okay? Like, I've noticed, there's some things going on with you that seem a little off, whatever. If you've heard a rumor, maybe you say, hey, I heard this about you. I hope it's not true, but I wanted to ask you about it. If this is true, I really wish you would consider not doing this or getting some help, or, there's a number of ways to approach that. So, as a school, if you know it's happening, if you know that a kid is binge drinking all the time and you don't say anything about it, and that kid is in a car wreck and that kid gets killed, and the parent finds out that you knew their kid was drinking very heavily and you didn't do anything, who do you think gets blamed? Teacher does. The parent is going to try to say that you're somewhat liable for the death of their child because you knew that something was happening and you did not report it. Now, is that realistic? Probably not, because probably if you had reported it, it's going to be your word against theirs. It's, that kind of issue. However, if it is something that you can prove, if you haven't